When Clint Eastwood walked into the Monterey County Courthouse, calm and unshaken, the arrogant prosecutor Elliot Graves barely spared him a glance. To Graves, Clint was just an aging actor, out of his depth, foolishly choosing to represent himself. What Graves didn't know was that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. Because Clint wasn't just fighting a legal battle, he was fighting for what was right. And when the truth came out, the courtroom was left in stunned silence. In true Clint Eastwood style, he turned the trial into a lesson in justice no one would ever forget. The Monterey County Courthouse was packed to the brim. Spectators filled every seat, some craning their necks from the back, eager to catch a glimpse of the legal showdown that had already gripped the public's attention. Reporters sat poised with their notepads, and legal analysts whispered among themselves, debating the outcome before the trial had even begun. Then Elliot Graves made his entrance. The arrogant prosecutor strode into the courtroom with the swagger of a man who already considered the case won. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor, he flashed a smug smile to the gallery before taking his place at the prosecution's table. His eyes flicked toward the defense side, toward the man who had the audacity to challenge him. Clint Eastwood sat there, still as a mountain. Dressed in a simple dark jacket and pressed shirt, he radiated quiet authority. There was no lawyer at his side, because Clint was his own lawyer. He had made the bold decision to represent himself, a move that sent whispers rippling through the crowd. A mistake, Graves thought with amusement. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Harold Whitmore settled into his chair. His sharp eyes scanned the room before he lifted his gavel. "We will have no theatrics in this courtroom," he warned, his deep voice carrying an unspoken "or else." The courtroom quieted. The case was straightforward, or so it seemed. The prosecution claimed that Clint had unlawfully seized land belonging to Gerald Matlock, a powerful real estate developer with deep pockets and even deeper political connections. Matlock had been chomping at the bit to take over a large swath of land in the hills, land that just so happened to belong to Clint. According to Graves, Clint had ignored property lines, encroached on Matlock's legally purchased acres, and refused to comply with county orders. Clint's response? He sat there, expression unreadable, hands resting loosely on the table. No outbursts, no theatrics, just a man who had been here before. The tension in the room was thick as the trial began. Elliot Graves rose from his seat with the air of a man who thought he was the smartest person in the room. He adjusted his cufflinks, stepped toward the jury, and offered them a smile, the kind of smile a car salesman gives before trying to sell you something you don't need. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth, confident, "we are gathered here today because of one simple truth. The law applies to everyone." He turned slightly, eyes flicking toward Clint, "even to men who have spent decades acting like they exist outside of it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Clint didn't react. Graves smirked before continuing, pacing slightly in front of the jury. "The defendant, Mr. Clint Eastwood, is a man of many talents, an actor, a director, a public figure." His tone dripped with condescension, but what he is not is a man of the law. A few chuckles rang out from the gallery. The jury shifted slightly in their seats, amused. Graves leaned in slightly, his voice lowering just enough to draw them in. "This case is not about Hollywood. It's not about fame or legacy. It's about a man who thought he could take what wasn't his." He gestured toward Matlock, who sat behind him, smug and satisfied. "The evidence will show that Mr. Eastwood deliberately and recklessly ignored property laws, that he ignored warnings, ignored boundaries, and acted as if rules don't apply to him." Another chuckle from the audience. Even the judge hid a smirk behind his hand. Graves turned to Clint now, as if speaking directly to him. Mr. Eastwood made the bold choice to represent himself. He spread his arms in exaggerated disbelief, a curious decision for someone who, forgive me, has no legal background. Laughter rang out again, louder this time, and still Clint did nothing. He sat there, watching. Not blinking, not flinching, not giving Graves a single inch. Graves turned back to the jury, voice dripping with confidence. "You will see, by the end of this trial, that the law is clear, and that no matter how many movies a man has made, he cannot rewrite the rules." He stepped back, satisfied, and returned to his seat. The jury was nodding. The judge seemed ready to proceed. The audience was fully on Graves's side, and yet something felt off. Graves glanced at Clint, and for the first time he hesitated, because Clint was watching him, not with anger, not with frustration, but with patience, like a man waiting for the right moment. And suddenly, Graves wasn't as confident as he had been 5 minutes ago. A long silence followed Elliot Graves's performance. The courtroom was still buzzing from his smug delivery, the jury still mulling over his sharp words. The air felt charged, thick with expectation. Then Clint Eastwood stood, no hurry, no theatrics, just a slow, deliberate movement as he adjusted his coat and straightened his posture. Unlike Graves, he didn't strut. He didn't pace. He simply stepped forward, rested his hands on the wooden defense table, and let the room settle. When he spoke, it wasn't loud, it wasn't booming, but everyone leaned in. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clint began, his voice smooth as sandpaper on polished wood, "I don't have a fancy speech for you." A pause. "I don't need one." The jury shifted. The murmurs in the audience stilled. Even the judge, who had been barely suppressing amusement moments ago, sat up straighter. "This is simple," Clint continued, his voice measured, carrying the weight of a man who didn't need to prove himself. "The law is the law, and the law says, I own that land." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and held it between two fingers. "I have the deed, I have the records, I have the proof." Graves smirked at the display, but something about Clint's tone made the jury lean in. Clint unfolded the paper, smoothing it out on the table in front of him. "Mr. Matlock here," he said, glancing toward the smug real estate tycoon, "thinks money gives him the right to take what isn't his. He thinks enough paperwork, enough legal tricks, enough influence will cover up the truth." Clint's eyes flicked up, sharp, focused. But the truth doesn't need tricks. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice, just calm certainty. And suddenly, Graves' carefully rehearsed performance felt like a cheap stage play. "You'll hear a lot of words over the next few days," Clint said, scanning the jury, "but at the end of it, the facts won't change." A slow pause, a steady breath. "I didn't take his land." Another pause. "He took mine." Silence. The jury wasn't chuckling anymore. Graves shifted in his seat. Clint simply gave a slow nod, folded his paper back up, and sat down. No flourish, no mic drop. Just a man who had already said enough. And in that moment, for the first time, Graves realized he might have underestimated him. Elliot Graves cleared his throat and rose to his feet. He wouldn't let Eastwood's theatrics, subtle though they were, throw him off his game. "The prosecution calls its first witness," he announced, turning toward the doors. A neatly dressed man in a crisp business suit strode forward. Lucas Miles, Matlock's chief surveyor. He took the stand, adjusted the microphone, and faced the jury with a rehearsed professional smile. "Mr. Miles," Graves began, "you work for Matlock Development, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And in your professional opinion, did Mr. Eastwood unlawfully prevent Matlock Development from accessing legally owned land?" Miles nodded, face serious. "Yes. Mr. Eastwood refused to remove fencing that cut into our development site. He ignored county orders and interfered with legally sanctioned construction." Graves turned, spreading his arms toward the jury. "You see, this isn't about legacy, it's about the law. Mr. Eastwood deliberately obstructed legal business operations." The jury nodded slightly. Graves smirked. He was back in control. "I'd like to submit Exhibit A," he continued, pulling out a stack of documents. official records from the county showing Mr. Eastwood's multiple violations. The judge gestured for the bailiff to take them to the jury. The papers made their way around the box: survey maps, zoning codes, legal notices, the kind of paperwork that could bury anyone who didn't know better. From his seat, Clint took a slow breath. He had seen this play before. Graves turned back to Miles. "One last question, Mr. Miles." His tone turned casual, conversational. "Does Mr. Eastwood have any legal expertise?" Miles chuckled. "Not that I'm aware of." Graves spread his arms, his smirk widening. "And there you have it." A ripple of laughter moved through the courtroom. He turned toward Clint, cocking his head. "Tell me, Mr. Eastwood, how does it feel to be lost in a world you don't understand?" More chuckles, a few outright laughs. Even Matlock hid a grin behind his hand. Clint didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He simply picked up his pen, made a single note on his yellow legal pad, then looked up, directly at Graves. A small thing, a nothing gesture. But suddenly the laughter died down, because there was something in Clint's gaze. Not anger, not frustration, something worse: patience. And for the second time that day, Graves felt something he wasn't used to feeling: doubt. The courtroom was thick with anticipation as Clint Eastwood rose from his seat. No rush, no wasted movement, just the deliberate steps of a man who had spent a lifetime knowing exactly when to speak. He approached the witness stand where Lucas Miles, Matlock's chief surveyor, sat with a confident smirk. Clint stopped in front of him, resting his hands lightly on the wooden barrier between them. "Mr. Miles," Clint said, his voice even, steady, "you said my fencing cut into your development site?" Miles nodded. "That's correct." Clint let the answer hang in the air. Then, from his pocket, he pulled out a folded document, unfolded it carefully, held it up for the jury to see. "This is my property deed." Miles's smirk twitched. Clint continued, his tone casual. "And this here," he tapped another page on the table, "is the county's official property line survey. Both of these documents were filed years before Matlock ever built a thing." He paused, then met Miles' eyes. "So, tell me again, how exactly was I trespassing?" Silence. Miles shifted in his seat. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, but no words came. Graves leapt to his feet. "Objection! Your Honor, Mr. Eastwood is not a legal expert. These documents are—" The judge raised a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Graves. I'd like to hear this." The prosecutor's jaw clenched. Clint continued, pulling out a third document. "This," he said, "is a revised zoning map showing that Matlock's company expanded beyond their approved area, right onto my land." The jury leaned forward. Miles swallowed. Clint let the weight of the moment settle before leaning in just slightly. "You're a surveyor, son. I assume you've seen this before?" Miles blinked. I... A single bead of sweat formed at his temple. The jury noticed. The courtroom noticed. And for the first time, so did the judge. A crack had formed in the prosecution's case, and Clint had only just begun. Elliot Graves was feeling the pressure. He could feel the jury slipping, could feel the energy in the room shifting toward Eastwood, and he hated it. So as Clint returned to his seat, Graves shot up, straightening his tie. Time to regain control. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pacing in front of the jury box, his tone thick with amusement. "What you just witnessed was a wonderful example of old-school charm." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Graves smirked. "Mr. Eastwood may be good at playing the tough guy on screen, but let's not forget, this is a court of law, not some old Western." A small laugh from the audience. Matlock grinned. Graves felt his confidence return. He turned toward Clint, his eyes gleaming with arrogance. "Tell me, Mr. Eastwood, do you actually believe a stack of old papers is enough to prove your case?" Clint didn't blink, didn't move, just sat there, watching. Graves continued, feeding off the jury's mild amusement. "Let's talk about actual evidence." He turned to the bailiff. "Please display Exhibit C." The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the projector flickered to life, revealing an aerial image of the disputed land. Graves gestured grandly. "This," he said, "is footage taken by an independent drone survey, which clearly shows that the property lines aren't as cut and dry as Mr. Eastwood claims." He pointed to the screen, zooming in. "See here? The fence line is unclear. The supposed trespassing might not be so one-sided after all." More murmurs. The jury exchanged glances. Graves smiled. He had them again. But then, a voice, low, calm, unshaken. "Are you sure about that, son?" The room froze. Graves turned to Clint, who was still sitting there, still motionless, but now there was something dangerous in his eyes. The judge sat forward. Even Matlock's smirk faded slightly. Graves's stomach twisted, because suddenly he wasn't so sure anymore, and something told him. Clint knew exactly what was coming next. The courtroom was still buzzing from Clint's last words. Graves had lost his smirk, his cocky attitude now replaced with the tightness of a man who just felt the floor shift beneath him. And Clint? He stood up slowly, walking to the center of the room with the same deliberate ease of a man who had spent his life knowing exactly when to draw his weapon. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the defense calls Jacob Reynolds to the stand." A murmur rippled through the crowd as an elderly man with silver hair and a firm posture made his way forward. Reynolds settled into the witness chair, adjusting his glasses, a man who had spent his career dealing in facts. Clint stepped closer. "Mr. Reynolds, can you state your profession for the court?" Reynolds cleared his throat. "I'm a retired land surveyor, 35 years in the business." Clint nodded. "And in your time surveying land, have you ever worked with Mr. Gerald Matlock?" Reynolds stiffened slightly, his fingers tapping the wooden armrest. "I have." Clint's gaze was steady. "And what did you find in your analysis of my property line?" Reynolds reached into a folder and pulled out official county records, unaltered, certified. He held them up. "That Matlock's development encroached on your land by exactly 22 feet. The courtroom erupted. Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel. "Order!" Clint remained still, watching Graves, whose jaw clenched ever so slightly. But Clint wasn't done. "Mr. Reynolds," Clint said, his voice even, "did Matlock or anyone from his team ever approach you about these findings?" Reynolds hesitated. Then, with a slow exhale, he nodded. "Yes?" Graves tensed. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Elaborate." Reynolds looked right at Matlock, his voice steady. "I was offered $50,000 to adjust my findings. When I refused, they threatened to ruin my career." A collective gasp. Matlock shifted uncomfortably. Graves shot to his feet. "Objection! Pure hearsay!" But Clint? He just smiled. "We'll see about that." Because the real show was about to begin. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Graves was sweating now. Matlock's fingers twitched on the table. Clint didn't rush, didn't speak. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black flash drive. The courtroom fell silent. "Your Honor," Clint said, walking toward the court clerk, "I have a piece of evidence that may clarify things." He handed over the flash drive. The clerk took it with careful hands, walking it to the judge. Judge Whitmore studied Clint for a moment before giving a small nod. "Proceed." The courtroom screen flickered to life, and then a hidden camera recording began to play. The grainy video showed a dimly lit office. Sitting inside was Gerald Matlock, and across from him, Elliot Graves. The entire room stiffened. On the screen, Matlock leaned forward, his voice low and unmistakable. "Eastwood's got no case, but I want him buried." Graves smirked, sipping a drink. "Don't worry, I'll make sure the jury sees him as nothing more than a washed-up old cowboy trying to play lawyer." Matlock chuckled. "And if he gets too close?" Graves waved a hand dismissively. "We've already handled the evidence. It'll be airtight. The jury will never know." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Graves's face drained of color. The judge's expression darkened. Matlock shot up from his chair. "That's doctored. That's—" Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel with force. "Sit down, Mr. Matlock." But it was Graves, now ghostly pale, who truly looked finished. "Clint?" He just leaned back, arms folded, watching. Because this wasn't just a case anymore, this was a reckoning. Graves' confidence had been shattered like glass. His hands trembled as he shot to his feet, desperation dripping from his voice. "Objection! This recording is unauthorized. He can't submit it as evidence." Judge Whitmore didn't even blink. "Overruled." His voice was cold, firm, absolute. Graves' mouth fell open. "Your Honor, this is a blatant violation of—" The judge's gavel slammed down. "I said overruled, Mr. Graves. Unless you'd like to be held in contempt, I suggest you take your seat." The jury stared at Graves now, not with respect, but suspicion. The arrogance, the charm, the control he had once wielded like a weapon was now turning against him. In the audience, reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, catching the moment a once untouchable prosecutor had been exposed. Clint leaned forward, folding his hands. His gaze locked onto Graves like a hawk watching prey. And then he spoke. "You underestimated me, son." His voice was low, steady, lethal. "That was your first mistake." A shiver ran through the room. Graves clenched his jaw, his nostrils flaring. He refused to go down like this. Not in front of this jury, not in front of the cameras. He had one last move, one last desperate gamble, and he was about to play it. Graves forced a deep breath and straightened his tie. His career was dangling over the abyss, but he wasn't done yet. Not yet. The prosecution calls Gerald Matlock to the stand. The tension in the room shifted as Matlock slowly rose, adjusting his expensive suit. He walked up, his movements stiff, uneasy. He sat, cleared his throat, and folded his hands in his lap. Graves turned to him, trying to muster whatever confidence he had left. "Mr. Matlock, let's set the record straight." His voice carried forced authority. "Did you ever fabricate evidence against Mr. Eastwood?" Matlock's jaw tightened. "No, of course not." Graves exhaled, relief flickering across his face. Until dash. Clint stood up, calm, cool, and ready. He approached the witness stand with deliberate ease. "Mr. Matlock," Clint said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had already won. "You're under oath." Matlock shifted in his seat. "I know that." Clint's blue eyes locked onto him like a steel trap. "Then let's go over this one more time. Did you, or did you not, alter property records to make it appear as though I had illegally seized your land?" Matlock's Adam's apple bobbed. A flicker of panic crossed his face. The room was so silent you could hear the tick of the clock. And then Matlock made the mistake of a lifetime. "Well, I wouldn't call it altering, per se. It was more of a, clarification." The words had barely left his mouth before he realized his mistake. The judge stiffened. The jury froze. The reporters nearly fell over themselves scribbling. Graves' face drained of all color. He buried his face in his hands. It was over. And Clint? He simply adjusted his coat, turned to Graves, and smirked. The courtroom was still as Clint Eastwood rose from his seat. He didn't move with flash or showmanship, no dramatic gestures, no theatrics. He simply stood, straightened his coat, and approached the jury with the steady confidence of a man who had already won. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clint began, his voice as calm as the rolling tide, "I won't waste your time. We've all seen the truth." The jury was locked in. He didn't need to raise his voice or make grand statements. His words carried weight because they were honest. "Mr. Graves came in here with a lot of confidence. He stood right where I'm standing and told you a story, one he expected you to believe without question." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the jury. "And yet, every single piece of evidence tells you something different." Graves shuffled in his chair. The judge remained stoic, but his eyes betrayed his respect. You saw the recording. You heard Matlock's own words. You watched as this case unraveled piece by piece because lies don't hold up against the truth. Clint turned slightly, glancing at Graves, who sat rigid and silent. And, Mr. Graves, he underestimated all of you. He gestured subtly toward the jury. He thought that if he talked loud enough, if he ridiculed me enough, he could distract you from what mattered. But the law isn't about who talks the loudest. It's about what's right. A subtle nod passed through the jury. Even the audience could feel it. Clint gave them a long, steady look before delivering his final words. You don't need me to tell you the right decision. You already know it. And with that, he walked back to his seat. No theatrics, no arrogance, just the truth. The jury was out for less than an hour. When they returned, the courtroom was a furnace of tension. Clint sat calmly, motionless, while Graves looked visibly shaken, his once perfect posture crumbling under the weight of impending humiliation. The foreman stood, holding the verdict in his hands. Judge Whitmore nodded. Has the jury reached a decision? The foreman cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. He unfolded the paper, his voice steady but firm. We find in favor of Mr. Eastwood. For a split second, the room was silent. Then, a shock wave rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scrambled to record the moment. Spectators whispered, some grinning as Graves stared at the jury, stunned. He looked like a man who had been knocked off his pedestal and hit every step on the way down. Clint gave a slow, deliberate nod. Not smug, not gloating, just satisfied. Judge Whitmore wasn't finished. His gaze turned to Graves, his expression dark. Mr. Graves, this court finds your conduct throughout this trial highly questionable. Manipulated evidence, suppressed records, deceitful practices, all of which will now be subject to a full investigation. Graves' face drained of color. I suggest you retain legal counsel, the judge added, his tone leaving no room for argument. You'll be needing it. Graves slumped into his chair, destroyed. The once arrogant prosecutor was now a broken man. Clint rose from his seat, buttoned his coat, and walked toward the exit. No need for words. The truth had spoken for itself. The courthouse doors swung open, and Elliot Graves stepped out into a storm of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. Microphones were shoved in his face, voices overlapping in a chaotic frenzy. Mr. Graves, do you have a response to the court's ruling? Will you be appealing the decision? What about the accusations of misconduct? Graves tried to maintain his composure, but the sweat on his brow and the slight tremor in his hands gave him away. He cleared his throat, forcing a weak smile. This case was misrepresented. The jury was swayed by theatrics rather than legal precedent. Are you suggesting the verdict was unfair? A reporter interrupted. Graves opened his mouth, but before he could answer, Gerald Matlock emerged from the crowd, his face twisted in anger. Matlock didn't even look at Graves. He simply stepped in front of the cameras, adjusting his tie. I had no idea my legal counsel would engage in such disgraceful tactics. His voice was cold, calculated. I trusted Mr. Graves to handle this case with integrity. Clearly, I was mistaken. The crowd exploded with questions, but Matlock was already walking away, leaving Graves standing there, alone. His last ally had just abandoned him. The cameras turned back to Graves, who looked completely lost. His lips moved as if trying to form an excuse, but no words came. And then a shadow passed over him. Clint Eastwood. He strolled down the courthouse steps, cool as ever, his boots tapping against the pavement. He didn't stop, didn't gloat. He simply tipped his hat and muttered, "You had this coming, kid." Graves flinched, as if the words had physically struck him. The cameras caught it all. As Clint walked off, the reporters swarmed Graves again, but he had no fight left. His career, his reputation, everything he built on arrogance and deceit had just crumbled in front of the world. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. The wind rolled across the land, rustling the tall grass. Clint Eastwood stood near the edge of his property. hands tucked into his pockets, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. This land, his land, was untouched, unspoiled, the way it should be. He had fought for it and won. The sound of boots crunching on gravel made him glance over his shoulder. Jacob Reynolds, his old friend and trusted surveyor, approached, hands in his coat pockets. "You finally did it, Clint," Jacob said, stopping beside him. "Matlock's gone. That land's yours, free and clear." Clint gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable. Jacob chuckled. "You know, you didn't just win in court, Clint." He gestured out toward the land, to the rolling fields and open sky. "You reminded them what real justice looks like." Clint didn't say anything. He just smirked, gave a small nod, and tipped his hat against the setting sun. A man of few words, because the truth had already spoken for itself. The headlines spread like wildfire. Across news stations, front pages, and social media feeds, Clint Eastwood's courtroom victory became the story of the year. Clint Eastwood stands up to corruption and wins. Hollywood icon defends his land, outsmarts arrogant prosecutor. Elliot Graves resigns in disgrace, Matlock under criminal investigation. Everywhere people were talking about it, the courtroom showdown, the bombshell evidence, the moment Graves crumbled under pressure. And at the center of it all, Clint Eastwood, the man, the legend. In Monterey County, Elliot Graves had vanished. His once pristine reputation was in ruins. The press hounded him for a statement, but there was nothing left to say. His resignation came in the form of a one-paragraph letter. No fanfare, no excuses. Just an abrupt, silent departure. Meanwhile, Gerald Matlock had bigger problems. The investigation into his forged documents, bribery attempts, and fraudulent land deals gained momentum. Prosecutors, real ones this time, were circling like vultures. His empire, once built on power and intimidation, collapsed overnight. For Clint, though, nothing changed. Back on his land, life continued as it always had. No interviews, no press conferences, no victory laps, just peace. Clint rode out to the far edge of his property one evening, the warm hues of the setting sun stretching across the open fields. He took off his hat, letting the wind roll through his silver hair, his eyes on the horizon. Jacob Reynolds rode up beside him, resting his arms on the saddle horn. "People are calling you a hero, Clint." Clint smirked, shaking his head. "People say a lot of things." Jacob chuckled. "They say you never back down from a fight." Clint slid his hat back on, nudging his horse forward. "Damn right." And with that, he rode off into the sunset. Because legends don't need to announce themselves, they just live. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even crazier.